Here's an interesting conundrum. What do you do when your fusible interfacing needs to be ironed? What do you do?
Oh.
You pray to the gods of sewing.
Well, I don't know that you pray to the gods of sewing, but here's what I do. I'm going to go ahead and cut a chunk that's slightly smaller, roughly the same size. You're right. I mean, the problem is you can't iron it, right? So what I do is I take it, I lay it out roughly, and then I use some straight pins. And notice, I start at the corner there, and I put my straight pin in on a severe angle, like so. So it's relatively flat. I'm trying not to stretch. I'm trying to just get it to lay flat. The reason that I put the pins in on the extreme angle is now I can do that, and they're not getting in the way.
Well, since it's on a knit, does it matter too much whether it's straight?
Not particularly. I mean, what I don't want to do is I don't want to stretch it so much that then it wants to recoil, because then the two would fight.
Watch your nose there, Connie.
There's number 2. Feel number 2.
3.
And number 3. The thing that's interesting is feel the difference between this and that interfaced scrap. I'm going to go ahead and do number 3 here. How differently do those two feel?
Really different.
Really different. That's a perfect example of the fact that it's actually the glue that's adding a lot of the structure and not the fabric itself. And number 3. You will notice also it changes as it cools down. So based on these 3 samples, which one do you like the best for our collar?
This one.
I like this one.
Other one.
Thank you.
Actually, I like this one.
That one feels closest to like the actual
Yeah.
fabric with just being a little bit more stuff to me.
To me, it is between these two. It's definitely not this one.
Yeah.
This one's super, super crispy. Because I don't think we have any white of this at the moment, I think automatically it becomes this. I'm also doing this because I can feel what it's going to feel like when it's doubled back on itself. Go ahead and do that. Touch the two that way.
Are you fusing both layers?
We are not fusing both layers. That's actually a good point. But we will end up with some of that in our seam allowance.
It's like the difference between slightly cooked spaghetti and raw spaghetti.
Put
Does
that
that-
in your PowerPoint.
Another choice you could have if you only have lightweight fusible.
Then
that you
fuse
can-
both layers.
You can, yeah, here.
Can you put fusing on top of each other?
Absolutely, you can.
Not the Stitch Witchery relief.
We there was a woman who was pretty much the lead draper at the Santa Fe Opera when Brenda and I were there. She was there for 100 years, and that's one of the things that I learned from her was make your own. Just make your own interfacing, and it was all about let's layer a little bit. Oh, I'll try a little bit of this. I mean, if she wanted to, she could have spent the entire day just doing samples, and she had her entire team doing samples. But the whole notion, she was also the person who taught me, if you're going to have a party, don't put ice in a cooler and then put the beer in it. Instead, put the ice in the washing machine and put your beer in the washing machine. Because then, at the end of the party, you just turn it to spin and it gets rid of all of the water.
That's
Asya
such a
taught me
great
that.
idea.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's you can't put a lot of beer in the washer, and you've only got one. But that kind of pragmatism, I think, is something that I really learned from her. And it's thinking outside the box of what Joanne's or the directions say to do. It's identifying, ironically, we're where we started. It's identifying where you are, where your point A is, point B where you need to be, and then using whatever means necessary to get there. Because ultimately, if you determine the logic to be able to get there, then it is the straightest point between, the straightest line between the 2 points.
Sure. I mean, if you're an artist and you have red, blue, and green, you're not just going to paint with red, blue, and green. You're going to figure out a way to...
But a lot of people, when it comes to this kind of stuff, don't think that way, especially if you've spent any time with commercial patterns and in a store like Joann's, because it's all very kind of, they've tried to categorize it, which is great for some things, but it's not helpful for other things. All right.
So the winner is
The winner is the white tricot. Let's talk about two last things before you start in on your collars. Okay, number one. Somebody had a question the other day of how do we true the collar pattern to the neckline?
yeah.
How do you true the collar pattern to the neckline?
Don't you said you kind of tilt it around?
You literally, somebody grab their collar pattern and their body pattern, and let's look. It's easy peasy, lemon squeezy. One of the things, when you draped your collar and you made your collar pattern, you should have ended up with 3 landmarks. You should have ended up with a center front edge, a center back edge, and a shoulder notch, right? So we are going to use those 3 landmarks to be able to lay it in against the neckline of the collar, or the neckline of the shirt, to be able to find out if it's true. So, number 1, here's Catherine's center back. So I can take my shoulder notch, because to me, in a way, the shoulder notch is the most important. And all I've got to do is match the 2 up. Sometimes when I'm truing, I roll this way. Sometimes I just do this. And look. We've actually got that much of a discrepancy, so we need to do a little truing up first. This is not the terrible news to me, because it may mean that the neckline is just a little bit too small. And then, of course, we do the same thing on the front. And it's nearly perfect. Now, the thing that's interesting is, look at how far we're off here. What is that telling me?
Is that notch off?
That this notch is slightly off, and then we have very little truing up to do, actually. So we just have to move that notch slightly. So the first thing you're going to need to do is true your collar to your neckline. And of course, the first thing I want you to do is to measure these so that I can then know what the circumference of the shirt neckline is.
How do we measure?
How do you measure? Great question.
Quick question.
Almost the same way. Either like this. If you look at any of my patterns, you'll see I do this, and then that was 4 inches. I just write 4 there. And then I do over here the same thing, and then I write the same number over there, and then I add them together. You can do this also. One of the things I really enjoy about the flexible rulers, 4 3/4, 4. If you want to, if you are concerned about them as a unit, you can treat them as an entire thing instead of 2 separates. What were you going to ask?
So, but isn't there going to be a little bit of ease? So isn't it supposed to be slightly bigger on both sides? No.
There should not be any ease. So step 1, measure your neckline. Step 2, true your collar to your neckline.
Is that after we've asked you if the next line
Correct.
is right?
Yeah. Step 3. What's step 3? Because there's one other thing that we haven't discussed in any of this
The
at all.
placket.
Well, ish. What do you mean by the placket?
Well, it has to open, so the collar, does it have to open? And then the collar has to have an opening there, so that's going to affect it.
Absolutely. So what Connie's talking about is currently your collar is patterned to either open at center back or at center front. Where's the opening on your shirt?
The placket.
It's at the placket. So the next thing you're going to have to do is modify this pattern so that it actually opens and closes right there. How are you going to do that?
Magic.
No.
Can you kind of just clip it off and add it?
Let's walk over here, back to our drawings.
Sorry.
Here's your initial pattern. Looks something like this, right? There, center front, there, center back. Can you see me, Kristen?
Barely.
Do you want to? Here, I'll come over there.
Oh, yeah, just come right here. Move all that.
So there's center back, there's center front, like that, right? So the first thing you're going to have to do is do an entire collar. So what do I mean by that? Trace so that it looks like so, and like so. So you've got an entire collar first. The next thing you're going to need is a notch. You've already got your shoulder notch right there. You need a notch that represents where your placket is. We've got our shoulder notch there. We've got our shoulder notch there. The next thing you've got to do is determine which side of the collar it goes on. Presumably we are wrong side up. So that means it's going to be longer on this side and shorter on this side. So I've marked that notch, so then Catherine is right. Essentially all we're doing is chopping off that chunk right there where our notch was, and then we're bringing it over here and adding it on. And then we end up with a center front notch as well.
Okay. I see. Oh, that's easy.
Here's the thing that's going to be weird about this, is you have to spend a little bit of time in your brain visualizing this in 3 dimensions. Because when you go to cut now, what this means is you're cutting 2 asymmetrical shapes. One that looks like that, and one that looks like that. Which one of these is the facing layer and therefore gets the interfacing?
The more curved one.
Well, they're identical. It's kind of a rhetorical question. The bottom line is you have to figure that out at this step along the way to be able to make sure that you're cutting them appropriately, because they are drastically asymmetrical. Does that make sense? I know.
Oh, okay.
Trying to figure out how to.
Do you just like turn your pattern piece?
Yeah, I mean, what I tend to do, let's pretend that this is, actually, where'd your pattern piece go? It's still over there.
You get it?
Thank you, since I'm too lazy to get up
So
here.
what do you mean by asymmetrical? Because we moved because of the placket.
Before we were symmetrical, when you draped it was symmetrical around a line of symmetry at center front and center back. Now, because the closure and therefore the edge of the collar has to end up over here, then the whole thing becomes asymmetrical. Because as Catherine noted, we're chopping this part off right there and then taping it on right there. Right? Mm-hmm. So then, because you've got, when they were symmetrical, you could just cut 2, like I did right here, and interface one of them, and then you could say, oh, this one's going to be the collar, and this one's going to be the facing. You can't do that any longer because they're specific, because it's asymmetrical. So you're going to have to take a minute and figure it out. What I tend to do is once I've got my pattern done, then I do this.
Or cut the both. Oh, no, you have to fuse first.
Except we have to fuse first. So I'll do this and go, oh, here's the right side of the fabric, so that means that's the wrong side of the fabric. So that means that when I cut this side up, I'm cutting the fashion layer, and so therefore the closure has to be over here. So
I
this is
understand.
the one.
That makes sense.
It's a weird you know, and you're gonna miscut. At least one of you is gonna miscut the whole thing, and it's okay.
Thank God it's just a small piece of paper.
Well, you know, and the bottom line is, you know, it's a really good learning exercise to sort of go through that mental process. And I still cut them wrong. I mean, I still get them wrong all the time. Like, fuck, that was supposed to be a right sleeve and now it's a left sleeve. It's not what I wanted at all. Oh well, you know, make it work.
Wouldn't it be asymmetrical anyway because it has the curve on the bottom?
No, because it would still have the same curve on the other side.
Right.
There's one last thing that we have to think about on your collar before you're ready to actually cut it though. Once you've done all of this, there's one other thing that needs to happen. Not exactly. You measure the circumference of the neckline of your shirt, and let's say it's 15 inches. And we know the closure is over here, and you've got your placket here. When I go to sew this onto this, is it really 15 inches?
No.
What is it?
Because there has to be the placket has a thingy.
We now have a 1-inch extension on the underlap side of the placket, right? So the other thing you then have to do is add an underlap extension, another inch. And then you're going to end up with even another notch. And actually that's the wrong side, which should be over here. I'm pretty sure. Where did I lose you? Or did I lose you?
Isn't there two sides of the placket? So isn't it an inch on each side?
Aha! Alyssa's doing math. Because you know you had an inch on this side of the slash and an inch on this side of the slash when you put the placket in. So shouldn't it be 2 inches?
One of them's turned in.
Exactly. One of them has been turned back on itself, so it's not actually adding any additional circumference. This side has, however, so it needs to be accommodated.
Why can't you just make the normal collar and then just cut into it?
Would you have any seam allowance?
No.
The other thing is,
Yeah. Okay.
you could do that, but you would have to choose, are you going to have a center back seam or a center front seam? Because you can't cut the thing in the tube. And so then you would end up with two seams, a seam here and a seam there, or a seam here and a seam here. And so this then allows you to do it with only one seam. Because if you have an additional seam here, how much more seam allowance and therefore bulk are you going to have in there?
A lot.
A lot.
When we sew the collar on, will it be open there or will it be closed?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Do we sew the collar together or do we leave it so that it's open?
As usual, she's a step ahead. How are you going to assemble this thing? Would you like to describe your method?
There's no facing in these, right?
Correct.
Neckline. So then I put my two collar pieces right sides together, and I sew up, over, and down. So the three, so up, over, and then down. And then miter my corners. Use the tailor's point to press, flip it around so it's
Turn it
right
right
side
side out.
out. Any understitching, Ted?
Nope.
And then just pressing, making sure that the seam is on the actual edge and not flipping to the outside. And then when you go to assemble it, you kind of peel back on one side.
Don't even go that far.
Okay, stop.
What I want you guys
Then-
to do for class on Monday is I want you to have the collars completely patterned, cut, assembled to themselves, and ready to put onto the shirt.
Okay.
So, you do have, roughly speaking, a rectangle. You'll have two rectangles that are shaped like this. So you'll take them, as Brenda said, you'll take them right sides together. You'll machine stitch up, across, and down. However, I want you to be really careful. This is another instance where you're actually starting at the corner to sew. You're not starting at the cut edge. So you're sewing here, 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 and then stopping at the corner again. How much seam allowance should you have on all of these edges when you go to cut these pieces?
Half an inch?
Let's go ahead and do a 1/2 inch on all edges. Do you think that's safe?
I actually do go all the way to the cut edge.
Shh. You've got a 1/2 inch. The next step after you sew is to trim your seam allowance. Get rid of half of that there, half of that there, half of that there. So you've only got a 1/4 inch. What was Brenda talking about when she said mitering the corners?
I have no idea.
Any idea?
Isn't there like extra support in that area so you can like sew into that corner?
Not exactly.
Yeah, I remember now. Or cut it into something.
Tell me if this makes sense
Oh,
to you.
cut the corner.
Yes.
There we go.
Tell me if this makes sense to you. Here's our ultimate shape. We've sewn these 3 pieces, we've trimmed everything down, and we're ready to turn the whole thing right side out. When I go to flip the thing right side out, where is this seam allowance here going? It's flipping over to there, right? In this direction. Where is this seam allowance going when I go to turn it right side out? It's flipping back in this direction. So what happens to this seam allowance right here? Part of it wants to go there, part of it wants to go there, so it crumbles up into a big ass ball. So what you're going to do is the other version of mitering the corner, because we talked about when you did the mitering stitch in your placket, I said we use this term in a couple of different ways. This time it's a cutting term, and so what it means is you're actually chopping that corner off first at a 45-degree angle before you try and turn the thing right side out. You want to cut close to the corner, but not cut all the way to the line of sewing that represents the corner. You need to leave about an 1/8 or a 1/16 of an inch. It's probably a single thread. You then will press these seam allowances open, flip the whole thing right side out, and press it flat. What's the tailor's point? Because Brenda mentioned using the tailor's point to be able to do this step. What is it?
Is that the pointy thing that you use? So,
Different.
Different but similar.
um,
You have 2 tools that you need to use here. The first thing is, what Catherine's referring to is the point turner. Where does the point turner live? In the drawer labeled point turner. And all it is something that has a point on it. So that when you go to turn the thing right side out, you know, because of the way that the whole thing's flipping, the seam allowance is going to fight itself a little bit. So you take one of those corners and you very carefully push it up in to make sure that you get a corner right there instead of getting a rounded edge.
And very carefully is.
Very carefully is key. What happens, because you've trimmed all of that junk away and you've only got somewhere between an 1/8 and a 1/16 inch of seam allowance there, what happens if you push too hard?
Poke a hole.
Bloop! Exactly. Don't do what I do, which is I use my scissors because I'm too lazy to get up and go get the point turner. And so then I do this and I shove the points of the scissors through because they cut. Don't be me.
Yes.
Be smart. Then you're ready to press the whole thing flat. Before you've tried to flip the whole thing right side out, you needed to use the tailor's point to press the seam allowance here, here, and here open. What's the tailor's point?
That thingy.
That thing that Brenda pulled out that also has a sort of blunted point on it. That way you can put your collar on top of it, get the corner of the tailor's point into this corner right here, and press all of the seam allowance open. Press all of this seam allowance open. You need to press the seam allowance open after you've done your 3 lines of sewing and mitered off your corners, before you try and turn the whole thing right side out.
Okay.
Okay? So let's just review what you need to do before class on Monday. Step 1, if you're not to this step, get to this step. Step 2, measure the neckline on the pattern of your shirt and tell me your Brenda, so we can assess its size. Step 3, that is my third finger. True the neckline of the collar to the neckline of the shirt, mathematically. So we're not talking about changing any shape or any lines. We're simply talking about making something larger or smaller to make sure they physically fit together. Step 4, make the pattern modifications to be able to move your closure off of center front over to side front where your placket currently is, and add the underlap extension to be able to accommodate the placket. They're being so quiet and so good, I totally forgot they were here, and then I saw them. Then, what's your next step? Cut your 2 layers. You're going to have to take the minute to be able to figure out which side you want up to be able to cut the fashion layer and which side is up to cut the facing layer, so that you can then fuse enough fabric and cut those 2 pieces with a ½ inch of seam allowance around all edges. And then your last step is to do what we refer to as bagging the 2 out. Bagging means that you're taking the things and putting them right sides together, sewing them on 3 sides, doing the mitering, doing the pressing, doing the trimming, turning it right side out. Why do we call it bagging?
Because it looks like a bag.
Exactly. You know, it's a very oddly proportioned bag. It's very, very long and narrow with a little bit of a curve and very shallow, but you are essentially creating a bag. It's kind of like creating a pillowcase.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the beginning of class on Monday, you will have your completed shirt and you will have your assembled collar for us to talk about how to put that on.
Okay.
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 And the interfacing's on their facing layer?
Correct. Your fused layer is your facing layer, your interior layer.
That part I remember.
Well, I didn't hear that part, so I just
Yeah,
wanted to make sure
like the
before I
only
told
I don't
them
think you
that.
were in the room actually when we talked about it.
Just want to double check before I...
Questions?
Yikes. I've got a lot of catching up to do.
Okay.